On the morning of April 16th, 1985, a man walked through the front doors of the Soviet Embassy on Wisconsin Avenue in Washington, D.C., carrying information that would destroy nearly every American intelligence asset operating inside the Soviet Union. His name was Aldrich Ames. He was 43 years old, a career CIA officer with more than 2 decades of service in Soviet counterintelligence. And inside the envelope he carried were the names of men and women who trusted the United States government to protect their identities. By the time he walked out of that building 40 minutes later with $50,000 in cash, he had crossed a line that would lead to executions, the collapse of American intelligence networks, and one of the most devastating betrayals in Cold War history. But to understand how Aldrich Ames arrived at that moment, you have to go back further to the accumulation of small compromises and mounting pressures that pushed a trained intelligence officer into a decision that would define the rest of his life. Aldrich Ames joined the Central Intelligence Agency in 1962, fresh out of college and following in the footsteps of his father, who had worked for the agency in administrative roles. He was 21 years old, smart enough to navigate the bureaucracy, ambitious enough to want advancement, but never quite exceptional enough to stand out among the agency's elite officers. His early assignments placed him in document analysis and research roles, the kind of positions where attention to detail mattered more than charisma or fieldcraft. By the late 1960s, he had moved into Soviet and Eastern European counterintelligence work, a specialty that would define his entire career. The work involved managing sources, analyzing intelligence reports from behind the Iron Curtain, and attempting to identify Soviet intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover in Western capitals. It was meticulous, often frustrating work that required patience and an ability to see patterns in fragmented information. Throughout the 1970s, Ames advanced through various positions within the agency's Soviet Operations Division. He served overseas postings in Turkey and Mexico City, and he worked headquarters assignments in Virginia, where he had access to some of the most sensitive compartmented programs in American intelligence. His colleagues would later describe him as competent but unremarkable. Someone who did his job adequately, but never with the kind of brilliance that earned rapid promotions or high-profile recognition. There were warning signs that should have raised concerns earlier. Ames developed a drinking problem that became increasingly noticeable to those who worked with him. He would show up to meetings smelling of alcohol, his performance would suffer during periods of heavy drinking, and his personal life began to unravel in ways that created obvious vulnerabilities. But the CIA's internal security apparatus in that era was less rigorous than it would later become, and officers with access to sensitive information were not subjected to the kind of continuous monitoring that might have caught these red flags before they became critical. You'd think someone would have noticed. You'd think the system designed to catch exactly this kind of vulnerability would have seen the signs. But that's the thing about betrayal at this level. It happens because people assume it can't. His first marriage to a woman named Nancy deteriorated slowly over the course of the 1970s, strained by his drinking, his absences during overseas assignments, and a general incompatibility that neither of them seemed able to resolve. When they finally divorced in the early 1980s, Ames found himself facing financial obligations that his government salary could not comfortably support. Alimony payments, legal fees from the divorce proceedings, and the cost of maintaining 2 separate households created a level of debt that felt overwhelming. He would later describe this period as one of constant financial anxiety. A sense of being trapped in a situation where his income would never catch up to his obligations, where every month brought new bills that he struggled to pay. If someone had been paying attention, if the agency's security officers had been monitoring his financial situation more closely, they might have recognized that Aldrich Ames was exactly the kind of compromised officer that hostile intelligence services look for. a man with access to secrets, mounting debts, and a growing resentment toward the institution that employed him. In the early 1980s, while posted to Mexico City, Ames began a relationship with a Colombian woman named Rosario Casas. She was younger, attractive, and accustomed to a lifestyle that far exceeded what a mid-level CIA officer could afford on his government salary. Rosario loved shopping, expensive restaurants, designer clothes, and the kind of social life that required constant spending. Her monthly telephone bills alone, calling family and friends in Colombia, ran into the hundreds and sometimes thousands of dollars. For Ames, who was already struggling with debt from his divorce, the relationship with Rosario represented both an emotional refuge and a new source of financial pressure. He wanted to provide for her, wanted to give her the life she was accustomed to. But his salary of approximately $60,000 a year simply could not support that level of expenditure. The gap between what he earned and what he needed was growing wider, and Ames began to feel a combination of desperation and resentment that would eventually push him toward a decision he might not have made under different circumstances. But here's what makes this story hit different. It wasn't just about the money. It never is with cases like this. It was about ego, about feeling undervalued, about wanting to prove something to someone, even if that someone was yourself. By 1985, Ames had returned to Washington and was working at CIA headquarters in a position that gave him access to extraordinarily sensitive information about American intelligence operations inside the Soviet Union. He knew the identities of nearly every human source the United States was running behind the Iron Curtain. He knew their cover identities, their methods of communication, their handlers, and the intelligence they were providing. It was the kind of access that made him invaluable to the agency, and catastrophically dangerous if that access were ever compromised. His financial situation by this point had become critical. He owed significant amounts in back taxes, credit card debt, and ongoing alimony payments. Rosario's spending had not decreased, and in fact seemed to accelerate as their relationship became more serious and they began discussing marriage. Ames would later claim that he felt trapped, that he saw no legitimate way to escape the financial hole he had dug for himself, and that the idea of selling information to the Soviets began as a desperate measure rather than an ideological commitment. The decision to betray his country was not made in a single moment, but rather through a series of rationalizations that Ames constructed over a period of weeks or months. He told himself initially that he would only sell low-level information, material that would not significantly harm American interests, but would generate enough money to solve his immediate financial crisis. He convinced himself that the Cold War was a pointless exercise anyway, that the ideological differences between the United States and the Soviet Union were exaggerated, and that intelligence officers on both sides were simply playing an elaborate game that had little real-world consequence. These rationalizations allowed him to justify what he was about to do, to frame betrayal as something less than treason, as a pragmatic solution to a personal problem rather than an act that would cost lives. And maybe that's the scariest part of this whole thing. How easy it is to convince yourself that wrong is right when you need it to be. On that April morning in 1985, Aldrich Ames walked into the Soviet embassy with an envelope containing information about CIA operations and a proposal. He would provide the KGB with intelligence in exchange for money, significant money, enough to resolve his debts and provide the kind of financial security he had never achieved through legitimate means. The Soviets, recognizing immediately the value of what was being offered, agreed without hesitation. They gave him $50,000 in cash that day, a sum that represented nearly a year's salary and felt like a lifeline to a drowning man. What Ames did not fully understand at that moment, or perhaps chose not to understand, was that there would be no turning back. Once he accepted that money, once he handed over those names, he had committed himself to a course that would eventually consume everything. What would you do? You're in debt, your family has expectations, and you have information worth millions of dollars. Would you hand over that envelope? Over the following weeks and months, Ames continued to meet with his Soviet handlers, providing more information, more names, more details about American intelligence capabilities. Each meeting brought more money. The payments grew larger as the Soviets realized the scope of what Ames could deliver. 50,000 became 100,000, then 200,000. And eventually the total amount he received over the course of nearly 9 years would reach somewhere between $2 and $4 million, making him one of the most highly paid American traders in history. But what those numbers don't tell you is what was happening on the other side of that exchange. Every name he gave meant someone's life was in danger. Every document he photographed meant an operation was compromised. Every meeting he had with his Soviet contact meant American intelligence was one step further behind in understanding what was happening inside the Kremlin. The information that Aldrich Ames provided to the Soviet Union between 1985 and 1994 resulted in the compromise of virtually every significant American intelligence asset operating inside the Soviet system. Men and women who had risked their lives to provide information to the United States, who believed they were protected by the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus in the world, were suddenly exposed. Some were arrested quietly and disappeared into the Soviet prison system. Others were executed, their families never told exactly what had happened or why. The CIA began to notice the pattern by late 1985 and into 1986. Sources that had been reliably providing intelligence for years suddenly went silent. Communication channels that had been secure were no longer functioning. Officers in the field reported that their contacts had failed to appear at scheduled meetings or had sent signals indicating they were under surveillance and could no longer operate safely. But the most devastating realization was still months away. Inside CIA headquarters, a small group of analysts began to suspect that something catastrophic had happened, that there was a systematic compromise rather than isolated incidents of bad luck or operational error. The question that haunted them was how. How had the Soviets managed to identify and roll up so many different operations that were compartmented and separate from each other? The most logical explanation, the one that no one wanted to voice but that became increasingly unavoidable, was that there was a mole inside the agency itself. Someone with access to multiple programs, someone who could see across compartments, someone who had betrayed not just one operation, but the entire network. And what makes this even more chilling is that this person wasn't some shadowy figure from a spy novel. He was sitting in meetings, eating lunch in the cafeteria, shaking hands with colleagues who trusted him completely. The search for that person would take years, involve some of the most methodical investigative work in the history of American counterintelligence, and would eventually lead back to a man whose financial lifestyle had been screaming red flags for anyone paying attention. Because while Aldrich Ames was selling his country's secrets, he was also making a critical mistake that every successful spy eventually makes. He started spending the money in ways that couldn't be explained. And when you're pulling down $60,000 a year, but living like you make 10 times that, people start to notice. The question was whether anyone would notice soon enough to stop him before more damage was done. If you've ever wondered how intelligence agencies catch moles, how they separate the signal from the noise in a world where everyone has secrets, then what's coming next is going to show you exactly how that process works. And trust me, it's more methodical and more terrifying than you'd expect. By the spring of 1986, Aldrich Ames had become two completely different people living inside the same body. At work, he was the dedicated counterintelligence officer, attending meetings about Soviet operations, reviewing classified cables, and maintaining the appearance of a loyal civil servant. At home, he was spending money at a rate that should have been impossible for someone earning his salary. And the disconnect between those two realities was about to become the crack in his carefully constructed facade. The money from the Soviets kept coming, deposited into accounts, handed over in cash during clandestine meetings, and funneled through systems designed to obscure its origin. And Ames, confident that he had covered his tracks, began to live the life he had always wanted. But what he didn't realize was that every purchase, every transaction, every visible upgrade to his lifestyle was creating a trail that would eventually lead investigators directly to his door. The first major red flag appeared in October 1989, when Aldrich and Rosario Ames purchased a house in Arlington, Virginia for $540,000. That alone wasn't necessarily suspicious. Plenty of federal employees owned nice homes in the Washington suburbs, financed through mortgages and careful saving. But Ames paid for the house in cash. The entire purchase, processed through a real estate transaction that left a clear paper trail, showed no mortgage, no loan, no long-term financing. Just a single payment of $540,000 from a man whose annual salary was approximately $60,000. When the transaction was recorded in county records, anyone with access to those records could see the discrepancy. A mid-level CIA analyst buying a house worth nearly 9 times his annual salary, paying cash, should have triggered immediate scrutiny from the agency's Internal Security Division. But in 1989, the CIA's financial monitoring systems were not as sophisticated as they would later become, and Ames's purchase went unnoticed by those who should have been watching. The house itself became a symbol of the lifestyle Ames was now living. It was a large, well-maintained property in an upscale neighborhood, the kind of home that required significant upkeep and property taxes. Rosario filled it with expensive furniture, redecorated rooms with materials and labor that cost tens of thousands of dollars, and hosted social gatherings that further cemented their image as a successful, affluent couple. Ames bought a Jaguar automobile, a luxury vehicle that cost approximately $50,000, adding another visible marker of wealth that didn't align with his government salary. His clothing changed. He began wearing tailored suits, expensive watches, designer accessories that colleagues noticed but didn't necessarily question. After all, maybe his wife's family in Colombia was wealthy. Maybe he had received an inheritance. Maybe he had made smart investments. These were the explanations people told themselves, because the alternative, that a trusted CIA officer was living far beyond his means through some illegitimate source, seemed too unlikely to seriously consider. But behind the facade of wealth and stability, Ames was becoming increasingly paranoid. Every time he met with his Soviet handlers, he worried about surveillance. Every time he passed information, he wondered if this would be the time he got caught. The psychological toll of living a double life, of knowing that discovery would mean life in prison and the destruction of everything he had built, began to manifest in ways that those close to him could see. He drank more heavily, often arriving at work with the telltale signs of a hangover. His performance reviews, while not catastrophic, noted inconsistencies and periods where his work quality declined. He became more isolated, avoiding social situations with colleagues where questions about his lifestyle might come up. And Rosario, who enjoyed the money and the lifestyle it provided, seemed either unaware of or unconcerned about where it was actually coming from. She continued spending at an extraordinary rate. Telephone bills that ran into thousands of dollars every month, shopping trips that generated credit card statements reflecting purchases that no reasonable person could justify on a government salary. The breaks in the case that would eventually lead to Ames's arrest began not with his spending, but with the catastrophic loss of American intelligence assets inside the Soviet Union. By 1986 and 1987, nearly every significant CIA source operating behind the Iron Curtain had been compromised. Officers who had been providing valuable intelligence for years suddenly stopped communicating. Dead drops went unserviced, safe houses were raided, and in some cases, sources simply disappeared, later confirmed to have been arrested, tried in secret, and executed. The pattern was undeniable. Something systematic had happened, and the CIA's Soviet division was left scrambling to understand how such a comprehensive collapse could have occurred. The initial theories focused on technical compromises. Maybe the Soviets had broken American encryption systems. Maybe surveillance technology had advanced to the point where previously secure communication methods were no longer viable. Maybe there had been physical surveillance that compromised multiple operations simultaneously. But as the analysis continued, those theories began to fall apart. The compromised operations were too diverse, too compartmented, too separated from each other to have been rolled up through a single technical breakthrough. The only explanation that made sense, the one that investigators kept returning to despite its implications, was that there was a human source inside the CIA itself. A mole with access to multiple programs, someone who could see across compartments and provide the Soviets with a comprehensive picture of American intelligence operations inside their country. In 1991, the CIA formed a small analytical team tasked with identifying the source of the compromises. The team included Sandra and Jeanne Vertefeuille, two experienced counterintelligence analysts who understood Soviet operations and who had the methodical patience required for the kind of detailed investigation this would require. If you're the type of person who appreciates the slow, deliberate work of catching someone who thinks they're untouchable, you're going to want to see how this unfolds, because what these two women did over the next 2 years was nothing short of remarkable. The investigative approach that Grimes and Vertefeuille developed was based on a simple but powerful premise. If there was a mole inside the CIA, that person had to have had access to the specific operations that were compromised. By creating a matrix of which operations had been blown and which CIA officers had access to information about those operations, they could narrow the list of suspects to a manageable number. They started with the compromised sources, documenting exactly when each one had been arrested or had gone silent. Then they cross-referenced those dates with personnel assignments, determining which CIA officers had been in positions where they could have known about those specific operations at those specific times. The work was painstaking, involving thousands of personnel files, security clearances, compartmented program access lists, and operational records. Every name that appeared on the list had to be investigated further, their financial records examined, their behavior analyzed, their associations reviewed. What emerged from this analysis was a list of approximately 40 CIA officers who had access to enough of the compromised operations to theoretically be the source. 40 people who could have betrayed their colleagues, their country, and the sources who had trusted the United States to protect them. The task now was to narrow that list further, to find patterns or anomalies that would indicate which of these 40 people was actually the mole. Grimes and Vertefeuille began looking at financial records, requesting access to credit reports, bank statements, and tax returns for the officers on their list. This was sensitive work, legally complex and potentially career-ending if they accused the wrong person. But the evidence they began to find was startling. Most of the officers on the list had financial profiles that matched their government salaries. Modest homes, reasonable cars, spending patterns that reflected middle-class federal employees living within their means. But one name stood out with glaring anomalies: Aldrich Ames. The financial profile of Aldrich Ames, when examined in detail, was inexplicable through any legitimate means. The $540,000 house purchased with cash, the $50,000 Jaguar, the extensive home renovations costing tens of thousands of dollars, the credit card statements showing purchases of expensive clothing, jewelry, and luxury items, the bank records showing cash deposits and wire transfers that had no clear legitimate source. When Grimes and Vertefeuille presented their findings to senior counterintelligence officials, the reaction was initially one of disbelief. Ames was a known officer, someone who had worked in Soviet operations for decades. The idea that he could have been betraying the agency for years without detection seemed almost impossible. But the financial evidence was undeniable, and when cross-referenced with the timeline of compromised operations, a disturbing pattern emerged. The compromises had begun in 1985, right around the time Ames would have first made contact with the Soviets, and they had continued consistently through the years when Ames had access to the relevant information. By 1993, the investigation had moved from analysis to active surveillance. The FBI, working in coordination with the CIA, began monitoring Ames's activities. They placed listening devices in his home and office. They tracked his movements through physical surveillance teams. They installed monitoring equipment in his Jaguar that would record his location and, in some cases, conversations he had while driving. They went through his trash, recovering documents, receipts, and other materials that might provide evidence of espionage. And they began building the kind of comprehensive case that would be needed to arrest and prosecute a CIA officer for treason. The surveillance revealed patterns that confirmed the investigators' suspicions. Ames would occasionally take unexplained trips, driving routes that seemed designed to check for surveillance before arriving at specific locations. He would use payphones rather than his home or office phone for certain calls. And he continued to spend money at a rate that remained inexplicable through any legitimate source. On one occasion in late 1993, surveillance teams observed Ames making what appeared to be a dead drop in a park in the Washington area. He placed a package near a specific tree, then drove away. FBI agents recovered the package and found that it contained a chalk mark on a mailbox, a classic espionage signal indicating that material was ready for pickup. The evidence was mounting, but investigators wanted more. They wanted to catch Ames in the act, to observe him meeting with his Soviet handlers or making a transfer of classified information. They wanted a case so airtight that there would be no possibility of Ames escaping justice through legal technicalities or lack of direct evidence. The surveillance continued through the fall and winter of 1993 and into early 1994. And if you think the tension of watching someone, knowing they've betrayed everything they were supposed to protect, knowing that one wrong move could alert them and cause them to flee, then you understand the pressure these investigators were under every single day. Because they weren't just building a case. They were preventing further damage, protecting sources that might still be at risk, and trying to understand the full scope of what Ames had compromised. In February 1994, investigators made a critical discovery. They had been monitoring Ames's communications, and they intercepted messages between Ames and what appeared to be his Soviet handlers, discussing arrangements for a meeting. The decision was made to move forward with the arrest, rather than risk Ames fleeing the country or destroying evidence. On the morning of February 21, 1994, FBI agents positioned themselves near the Ames residence in Arlington. The plan was to take him into custody as he left for work, a time when he would be outside his home but not yet in a position where he could easily escape or endanger others. Aldrich Ames, unaware that his nearly 9-year run as a Soviet spy was about to end, got into his Jaguar that morning just as he had done countless times before. And as he backed out of his driveway, FBI agents moved in and blocked his vehicle. Within seconds, he was surrounded, ordered out of the car, and placed under arrest. Rosario Ames was arrested simultaneously inside the house. The man who had betrayed nearly every American intelligence asset inside the Soviet Union, who had caused the deaths of sources who trusted the United States to protect them, who had collected millions of dollars in exchange for his country's secrets, was now in federal custody. And the question that investigators would spend the next several months trying to answer was not just what he had done, but why. What had driven a man with decades of loyal service to cross that line? Was it really just about money? Or was there something deeper, some resentment or ideology that had motivated the most devastating betrayal in CIA history? The answers would come, but they would reveal a portrait of a man far more ordinary, far more banal in his motivations than anyone expected. And maybe that's the most terrifying part. That someone capable of this level of destruction wasn't some mastermind or ideological zealot. He was just a guy who wanted a nicer house and couldn't see past his own desires to the consequences of his actions. The interrogation room where Aldrich Ames sat on the afternoon of February 21st, 1994, was unremarkable in every way, except for what was about to happen inside it. Gray walls, a metal table, uncomfortable chairs, and fluorescent lighting that made everything look washed out and clinical. Across from him sat FBI agents and CIA counterintelligence officers who had spent years building the case that had led to this moment. And what they wanted now was not just a confession, though that would be valuable, but a complete accounting of everything Ames had done, every source he had compromised, every operation he had betrayed, every piece of classified information he had handed over to the Soviets. Because without that information, the damage assessment would be incomplete, and the intelligence community would never fully understand the scope of what had been lost. Ames, for his part, seemed almost relieved. The weight of living a double life for nearly 9 years, the constant paranoia, the fear of discovery, had finally been lifted. He was caught, and there was a strange kind of peace in that finality. Over the course of the next several weeks, Aldrich Ames provided what would become one of the most comprehensive debriefings of a Soviet spy in American history. He confirmed that he had first approached the Soviet embassy in April 1985, motivated primarily by financial desperation. He described the initial meeting, the $50,000 he received, and the information he provided in exchange. He explained how the relationship with his KGB handlers had developed over time, moving from occasional contacts to a systematic arrangement where he would photograph classified documents, compile lists of CIA assets, and provide detailed briefings about American intelligence operations. He admitted that he had compromised virtually every significant human source the CIA had inside the Soviet Union, naming names that investigators had suspected but needed confirmed. And he provided details about the mechanics of how the espionage had been conducted. The dead drops, the signal sites, the communication protocols that had allowed him to pass information to the Soviets without being detected for so long. What emerged from these debriefings was a portrait of betrayal so comprehensive that it shocked even the experienced counterintelligence officers conducting the interrogation. Ames had not just compromised a few operations or revealed some classified documents. He had systematically dismantled the entire American intelligence infrastructure inside the Soviet Union. At least 10 Soviet citizens who had been working with the CIA were confirmed to have been arrested and executed as a direct result of information Ames provided. Others disappeared into the prison system, their fates unknown. The operations they had been part of, some of which had been running successfully for years, were completely destroyed. The intelligence those sources had been providing, material that had helped American policymakers understand Soviet military capabilities, political intentions, and strategic planning, was suddenly unavailable. And the replacement of those sources, the rebuilding of that intelligence network, would take years and in some cases would never be fully accomplished. The financial accounting of what Ames had received from the Soviets was equally staggering. He confirmed that over the course of approximately 9 years, he had been paid somewhere between $2 and $4 million, making him one of the highest-paid spies in the history of Cold War espionage. Some of that money had been paid in cash during meetings with his handlers. Some had been deposited into foreign bank accounts that Ames could access through wire transfers. And some had been funneled through transactions designed to look legitimate, including wire transfers to Colombia that Ames claimed were from Rosario's family, but were actually Soviet payments being laundered through a third country. The money had paid for the house in Arlington, the Jaguar, the expensive renovations, the designer clothes, and the extravagant lifestyle that should have raised red flags years before. It finally did. When investigators asked Ames why he had done it, why he had betrayed his country and caused the deaths of people who had trusted the United States to protect them, his answers were disturbingly banal. He talked about financial pressure, about feeling undervalued by the CIA, about wanting to provide a better life for Rosario. He expressed some regret for the sources who had been killed, but in a detached way that suggested he had compartmentalized their deaths as unfortunate but necessary consequences of his actions. He claimed that he had convinced himself the Cold War was essentially over by the mid-1980s, that the ideological differences between the United States and Soviet Union were exaggerated, and that the intelligence he was providing wouldn't really matter in the grand scheme of history. These rationalizations, transparent and self-serving as they were, revealed a man who had constructed an elaborate mental framework to justify betrayal, who had convinced himself that what he was doing was somehow less terrible than it actually was. The legal proceedings against Aldrich Ames moved forward with the efficiency that federal espionage cases require when the evidence is overwhelming. His attorneys, recognizing that a trial would result in certain conviction and likely a death sentence, negotiated a plea agreement. In exchange for Ames's full cooperation in the damage assessment and his agreement to plead guilty to all charges, prosecutors would take the death penalty off the table. Additionally, the agreement stipulated that Rosario Ames, who had been arrested alongside her husband and was facing her own charges of conspiracy and tax fraud, would receive a reduced sentence. On April 28, 1994, Aldrich Ames appeared in federal court and pleaded guilty to espionage charges. The judge, after hearing a summary of the evidence and the scope of the betrayal, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rosario Ames, who had cooperated with investigators and provided information about the couple's finances and lifestyle, pleaded guilty to lesser charges and was sentenced to 63 months in federal prison. The damage assessment that followed Ames's confession took months and involved dozens of intelligence officers reviewing every operation he had access to and every piece of information he had provided to the Soviets. What they discovered was that the compromise extended beyond just human sources. Ames had also provided information about technical intelligence collection methods, satellite reconnaissance capabilities, signals intelligence programs, and counterintelligence operations targeting Soviet intelligence officers in the United States. The Soviets had used this information to adjust their own security procedures, to protect their intelligence officers operating abroad, and to feed disinformation back through channels they knew the Americans were monitoring. The strategic advantage the United States had enjoyed in understanding Soviet capabilities had been significantly degraded, and the rebuilding of that advantage would require years of work and significant resources. For the families of the sources who had been executed because of Ames's betrayal, the damage was personal and irreversible. These were people who had risked everything to provide information to the United States, who had believed that their cooperation would be protected, that their identities would remain secret, that they would be safe. And instead, they had been handed over to the very government they were betraying, arrested, tried in secret proceedings, and in many cases executed by firing squad. Their families, in some cases, never learned the full truth of what had happened or why. The CIA, for security reasons, could not always acknowledge that these individuals had been working for American intelligence, which meant their sacrifices went unrecognized, and their families were left with questions that would never be fully answered. If you've ever wondered about the real human cost of espionage, about what happens to the people who get caught in the machinery of intelligence operations, this is it. Real people with families, with lives, with hopes for the future, all extinguished because one man decided his financial comfort was worth more than their survival. The institutional impact on the CIA was profound and led to significant changes in how the agency handled internal security. The fact that Aldrich Ames had been able to operate as a mole for nearly 9 years, despite multiple red flags that should have been detected earlier, revealed serious deficiencies in the agency's counterintelligence and security procedures. Why had no one questioned his sudden wealth? Why had the $540,000 house purchased with cash not triggered an immediate investigation? Why had his alcohol problems and declining work performance not resulted in closer scrutiny? These questions led to a comprehensive review of personnel security protocols and resulted in new systems for monitoring the financial activities of officers with access to sensitive information. Polygraph examinations became more frequent and more focused on indicators of potential compromise. And the culture within the agency shifted toward greater awareness of insider threats and the importance of reporting suspicious behavior. Sandra and Jeanne Vertefeuille, the two analysts whose methodical investigative work had been instrumental in identifying Ames as the mole, received recognition for their efforts, though much of their work remained classified for years after the case was resolved. Their approach, building matrices of access and cross-referencing compromised operations with personnel assignments, became a model for future mole hunts and demonstrated the value of patient, detail-oriented analysis in counterintelligence work. They had spent years going through files, building timelines, and narrowing the list of suspects, all while knowing that the person they were looking for was still actively betraying operations and putting lives at risk. The pressure they had worked under, the responsibility they had carried, was immense. And when the case finally broke and Ames was arrested, there was satisfaction in knowing that their work had made the difference, but there was also the sobering reality of what had been lost in the years before they caught him. Aldrich Ames is currently serving his life sentence at a federal prison, where he will remain until his death. He has given occasional interviews over the years, some of which have provided additional insights into his motivations and his perspective on what he did. In these interviews, he has continued to express limited remorse, often framing his actions as responses to systemic problems within the CIA or as reasonable reactions to his financial circumstances. He has claimed that the sources he compromised were engaged in betraying their own country and therefore bore some responsibility for their fates. A deflection that ignores his own role in causing their deaths. And he has suggested that the damage he caused was exaggerated, that the intelligence he provided to the Soviets was not as strategically significant as the CIA claimed. These statements reveal a man who, even decades after his arrest, has not fully confronted the enormity of what he did or accepted genuine responsibility for the consequences of his actions. and Rosario Ames was released from federal prison in 1999 after serving her full sentence. She returned to Colombia, where she attempted to rebuild her life away from the scrutiny and stigma of being married to one of America's most notorious traitors. In interviews conducted years later, she maintained that she had not known the full extent of what Aldrich was doing, that she had believed his explanations about family money from Colombia, and that she had been as shocked as anyone when the truth came out. Whether that account is entirely accurate remains a matter of debate among those familiar with the case. The evidence suggests that Rosario was aware, at least at some level, that the money funding their lifestyle was not coming from legitimate sources. Though the degree of her active participation in the espionage remains unclear, what is clear is that she benefited from the money Ames received from the Soviets, and that her spending habits created some of the financial red flags that eventually led investigators to her husband. The legacy of the Aldrich Ames case extends far beyond the specific operations he compromised or the sources whose lives were lost. It fundamentally changed how the American intelligence community thinks about insider threats, about the vulnerabilities created when trusted officers with access to sensitive information become compromised. It demonstrated that loyalty cannot be assumed, that financial pressures and personal grievances can override years of training and institutional commitment. And it showed that even the most sophisticated intelligence agencies can be penetrated from within if the right person with the right access decides to betray their responsibilities. The case became a watershed moment in American counterintelligence, studied in training programs, analyzed in academic papers, and referenced whenever discussions of insider threats and mole hunts arise. And for those who lived through it, who watched American intelligence networks collapse and who worked to identify and stop the person responsible, it remains one of the most painful chapters in the history of the CIA. The story of Aldrich Ames is not a story about ideology or political conviction. It's a story about greed, weakness, and the terrible things that ordinary people are capable of when they convince themselves that the rules don't apply to them. He wasn't a mastermind or a zealot. He was a middle-aged bureaucrat with money problems who made a choice that destroyed lives and damaged his country's security. And maybe that's why this story matters more than tales of more dramatic spies or more elaborate operations. Because it shows that betrayal doesn't require grand motivations or complex schemes. Sometimes it just requires someone who wants a nicer house and is willing to sacrifice everything, including human lives, to get it. If stories like this make you think differently about trust, about institutions, about the people we assume are protecting us, then you understand why these cases get studied and retold and analyzed decades after they happen. Because the lessons they teach aren't just about catching spies. They're about understanding human nature at its most compromised and most dangerous.